So I'd like to start with an excerpt from a piece by Stuart Wheeler, who will be graduating soon from BYU in music composition. And some of you might also know him. He's the lead singer and guitarist for a pretty great Provo band called Quiet House. We're going to listen to about 3 minutes from his 90-minute piece, As One, Holy, Holy, Holy. The piece, this was his senior recital piece for his composition degree. The piece is scored for pump organ, violin, and cello. And over the course of its duration, it slowly expands from a unison, so everybody on the same note, outward, like slow motion slide whistles, requiring the string players to make very small continual adjustments on the fingerboards of their instruments. This might go on longer than some of you expect, or maybe that some of you wish. And it might make you physically uncomfortable. And in fact, it's the physical experience of this music that I really want to get at. I want to play it long enough for your ears to hear past the notes and notice the tactility of the sounds rather than the intonation of the notes. What we're doing here is we're trying to zoom into the gap between the keys on the keyboard to find all of the notes that exist between the notes. Between the notes on the keyboard or between the blobs of ink on the page, on the staff. So this will run for about 3 minutes. come back to that in a minute, or later. What I'd like to do in this presentation is to delve in a more explicitly Mormon way for a more specifically Mormon audience than I usually do, into questions that have arisen in my research on American experimental and minimalist music. Research which rather unexpectedly brought me into circles of artists that are or were Mormons. What I discovered is that there was this strange and conspicuous overlap between the populations of two pretty specialized Venn circles. Composers of note who came from LDS backgrounds, and composers of note who were interested in what we'll call microtonality. And we'll wade further into the acoustical weeds a little bit to explain that term, microtonality, in a little later with some audio examples. But before we do that, I want to take advantage of this event and this audience to put kind of a finer Mormon point on some of the questions that my research has explored. In one way or another, these questions all refract a core element of Mormon cosmology that has already come up several times at this conference. Divine embodiment, or the idea that God, as D&C 130 puts it, has a body of flesh and bones, as tangible as man's. Embodiment and the notion of embodied knowledge, or knowledge that is acquired through and housed within the physical bodily experience. These are concepts that have found their way into a number of academic methodologies and disciplines. In music scholarship in recent years, reflection on the body and the bodily experience has informed critical studies of music and sexuality, music and gender, music and dance, music and ritual, and so forth. And these kinds of studies explore in various ways how the physical body, not just the hearing mechanism and the psychoacoustic mechanism, but the body as a whole helps us understand and appreciate and engage with music. And I believe that, I put fleshing out the discourse, and that was really an unfortunate, but I believe that fleshing out the discourse about embodiment, and my dad would be so proud, and that arts can shed some light on Mormon culture, a culture which I believe is permeated with embodiment cosmology in ways that are both obvious and subtle. So a preliminary question for us is, how does Mormonism's cosmology of divine embodiment manifest as embodied knowledge? Truman G. Madsen observed, as I vividly remember from the cassette tapes that my mission companion listened to, that Mormonism's tangible God required more immediate accountability and action. He said, such personal beings can get involved in your life, changing it, giving specific commandments and counsels, rebuking, approving, or disapproving. A God who is utterly distant stays out of your hair. Or in other words, there's a connection between a sermon preached at the front of the room and the habitual self-organizing chair-putting away part of Mormonism that happens afterwards at the back of the room. We're a hands-on culture, literally. If you consider the role of literal touch in transferring divine power and authority, a priesthood line of authority is in part an account of chained physical contact, hand to head. So that brings us to the next question. How does Mormon embodiment find its way into Mormon musical practices? What does it sound like to imagine, as James Faulconer says, that God exists in the world in something like the way that we do, or that spirit is a more refined kind of matter? Is belief in embodiment something that can itself become embodied knowledge, specifically the embodied knowledge of hearing and sound? And often when we talk about music and religion, there's a kind of tacit assumption that we're talking about music in which sound is kind of a vehicle for a religious narrative, an accompaniment to a ritual, a setting of a liturgical or a devotional text, a sound painting of a religious story. And the question that emerged from my research on this curious cohort of microtonal composers who were Mormon, or Jack Mormon, as we might put it, this was the question: can Mormonism inform not just the subject matter chosen by Mormon composers who otherwise practice in whatever way composers do, but their actual fundamental approaches to sound? Can it manifest as compositional technique rather than just topic? What happens when a young musical Mormon mind ponders the cosmos in the way Joanna Brooks describes? This quote sort of haunts me as I try to think kind of psychobiographically about these composers. Joanna Brooks put it this way: "This is how I came into this world of believing, an ancient spirit striving to remember the shape of eternity at the kitchen table." What I'd like to propose is that one way that Mormon concepts about the relationship between matter and spirit inform some composers from Mormon backgrounds is to nudge their imaginations into those gaps between the notes, as if searching orally for the more refined kind of spiritual matter that Mormonism imagines between the particles of physical material. Microtonal music by Mormons can be seen as a manifestation of Mormonism's audaciously casual presumption of the interpenetration of the spiritual and material worlds. And so, at risk of belaboring the point, a textile metaphor might help. Certainly there are Mormon things you can silkscreen onto t-shirts, and that's a kind of culture. But is there a Mormon way to sew or to tailor a garment of clothing? Is there a Mormon way to weave the cloth? And perhaps this is where the metaphor intersects with tuning. Is there a Mormon way to spin the thread? Or, to put an even more ridiculously fine point on it, is there a Mormon way of herding the sheep? Which is where this story actually begins for the first of the three examples that I'll talk about today. Lamont Thornton Young was born in this cabin in Bern, Idaho in 1935 to Dennis Young, a sheep herder, and Evelyn Kuntz. And Bern, Idaho is still full of Youngs and Kuntzes. When Young recalls his childhood, he emphasizes memories that foreshadow his later life as a minimalist composer. The sustained drone of the wind through the cracks between the logs of this cabin, which is his earliest memory. The buzz of the crickets in the fields, the hum of the electrical step-down transformer near his grandfather's Conoco station. In his childhood, he also learned hymns and cowboy songs, and he showed promise on the saxophone during his junior high years spent in American Fork. By the time he was in high school, the family had relocated to Southern California, where he fell in among a cohort of extremely ambitious young jazz musicians. And while he was at LA City College, he likes to boast that he was in the same jazz band as Eric Dolphy, who was his later sideman to Coltrane. And they both played saxophone in the jazz band, and he beat out Eric Dolphy in a chair audition. College and grad school in California, LA City College, and then UCLA, and then grad school at Berkeley, saw him through a number of different musical obsessions, and by the time he became ensconced in the downtown scene of New York City in the 1960s, he likes to say that Berkeley sent him there on a grant as sort of hoping that it would be sort of a one-way ticket, so he wouldn't come back and pester them. And it worked. So by that time he was experimenting with extremely long durations and extremely intense microtonal experiments. He contributed extensively to the Fluxus publications. He curated concerts for Yoko Ono, and his Theater of Eternal Music ensemble became a kind of training ground and laboratory for a handful of influential musical luminaries. So here's a photo. This photo appeared in Vogue in May 1966. He had quite a feature article in Vogue. He kind of took that scene by storm when he appeared just sort of out of nowhere as a very young and audacious composer, very opinionated, and really quite bold. For a while in the 60s, if he got a commission, he would charge more money, or at least he purported to charge more money the shorter the piece was. Here's another photo of the Theater of Eternal Music Ensemble, one incarnation of it. And so this strange little group became very influential, even though Lamont himself never attained kind of the celebrity status of many of the composers who were influenced by him, like Philip Glass, or Steve Reich, Terry Riley, or the Velvet Underground, or Yoko Ono. Young's rhetoric at this time was steeped in Eastern mysticisms and the aspirationally transcendent language of the psychedelic movement, which he intersected with in a number of ways. But when he articulated the mythological elements of his music, he often couched it in terms familiar to Mormons. So and this is where I really started to pick up on this. I read an interview with him in Helena magazine, a counterculture magazine, and the interviewer said, "So it seems like you're really interested in issues of eternity and infinity. Why is that?" And Lamont said, "Well, you know, I'm interested in basic questions of existence, like where are we from, and why are we here, and where are we going?" Like straight out of the Fourth Missionary Discussion. The most obvious connection is his obsession with eternity and its correlation to the long durations of many of his works and the long durations of the chords within them. Another aspect of Young's persona that seems to refract a kind of Mormonism is his conviction of artistic prophecy. He acknowledges and claims divine inspiration. And eventually, as Young undertakes an extensive study of Indian music under his guru, Pandit Prannath, that prophetic framework for artistry finds alignment with the profound guru-disciple relationship through which Indian musical knowledge is traditionally transmitted. And so by the time he was interested in Indian music, he was pretty distant in practice from his native Mormonism. But these structures seem to kind of rhyme with each other in some ways. Eventually, this inspiration developed an element of restoration to it. A musical restoration that takes the form of a rejection of modern and ubiquitous approaches to tuning, and a return to principles of tuning that are acoustically and numerologically more cosmically potent, or even theurgic, as he sees it. So we're going to look at two of Young's most important works as examples. The first, The Well-Tuned Piano, is an ongoing project that he initially started in 1964. And this is one of a number of his works that you don't put a date on it, you put a date range on it, because it's kind of an evolving piece. And he kind of thinks of each performance of it as a composition rather than the thing as a composition. And he's always kind of sort of trying to expand or explode the boundaries of something. So he takes a composition and tries to turn the composition into a genre, in a way. So that's what happens with this, the Well-Tuned Piano. So we're going to listen to a recording from 1981. This recording was longer than 5 hours, and a later recording. So this recording appeared on 5 or 6 LPs. Was it 5? Or CDs, and then later. When the technology became available, yeah, he recorded a longer version on DVD that ran about 6.5 hours. It was so long that there was no room for any of the other stuff that appears on a DVD. Like there's no clock on the screen and no director's cut. There's not even a menu. It just plays and fills up the disc. Anyway, we're going to hear two of the ways that Young's use of alternate and very particular tuning of the solo piano uses the acoustical properties of the notes between the notes to evoke or even facilitate some kind of psychoacoustic transcendence. And you can kind of see, I mean, it's pretty explicit in the title, the well-tuned piano is a response to Bach's well-tempered clavier that is kind of held up as erroneously it turns out, but it's held up as an exemplar of what the modern tuning that's ubiquitous today can do. And Lamont proposes this piece as kind of an answer to the well-tempered clavier, because that's what, you know, a 29-year-old composer does. Is he tells Bach that he did it wrong. Anyway, so we're going to listen to two different ways that the way he tunes the piano. And the tuning, I don't want to get too technical, but the tuning is really unusual. If you think of the typical piano keyboard with 12 half steps to the octave, think of each of those half steps as 100 cents. And each one is 100 cents, so all the rungs of the ladder are equidistant from each other, right? In the tuning for the well-tuned piano, some of those half steps are over 200 cents, and some of them are as small as 28 cents. So, in other words, the rungs of the ladder are spaced very irregularly. And you'll be able to hear there's a really unusual resonance to the piano with these intervals. And they're not just randomly spaced either. They're spaced in a very particular way, in a very mathematically deliberate way that has these very specific sort of resonant products. So the first kind of thing we're going to listen to is what Lamont calls a cloud section. And there are a number of these cloud sections throughout the piece. There's no score for the well-tuned piano. There's kind of a sketch of chordal areas and figures that Lamont improvises upon in a sort of planned out way. But in each of these areas dominated by a particular chord or a particular musical figure, he kind of swims around in it for a while. And in some of these, his manipulation of the keyboard gets faster and faster so that the notes kind of pile up in this big resonant jumble, and all of these other sounds kind of pop out of this cloud. And so as we listen to this, you're going to have to kind of point your ears a little bit higher than the notes that he's playing on the piano, because the interesting stuff, or a lot of the interesting stuff, is happening above that as the notes and the overtones of the notes kind of interact in the air in interesting ways. mention here that Young gives these evocative names to every figure and every chord throughout the piece. And these names help us to kind of read the piece in a sort of quasi-narrative way. So in these next 3 excerpts, which are in the performance, are separated by several minutes. In the next 3 excerpts, we're going to hear what Lamont describes as 3 successive pools: the deep pool, the deeper pool, and the deepest pool. And the depth of the pool is indicated by a low E flat. And the first one that we hear is pretty low, the deep pool. The second one that we'll hear is the deeper pool, and that E flat is the lowest E flat on a normal piano. Then the deepest pool goes down an octave even further to an E flat that only exists on a very particular kind of piano. He plays this on a Bosendorfer Grand Imperial that has extra keys at the bottom. The other interesting thing about this low E flat is that lowest one within Lamont's tuning system comes in at about 18 point something hertz. And the lower, the floor for human hearing is generally described as 20 hertz. And so this pitch is supposed to be lower than you can hear. And so you hear it as like some quick thumps rather than a pitch. But because of the relationship of the notes above that low note, the mathematical relationships, they're all whole number multiples. The frequencies are whole number multiples of the low note. And if you want to nerd out on the tuning math, we can do that afterwards. But at any rate, the tuning of the notes above that low note gives us a kind of psychoacoustical context, so that when we hear that note, our ears and our bodies give it a place in our sort of sonic perception that normally it wouldn't be able to occupy. So we'll listen first of all to the deep pool, and then the deeper, and then the deepest. Here's the deeper pool. Before I play the deepest pool, I also just want to point out this is a good place to hear what happens acoustically between these intervals that have these very particular intonational relationships with each other, because you might hear that there's a kind of texture, there's a kind of a beating to the resonance of the piano that isn't there in the same way on a piano tuned conventionally. And if you listen closely, you'll hear that beating or that texture is different with each interval. The bumpiness of the sound isn't random, it's very particular to each interval. So here's the deepest pool. The next piece I'm going to talk about is the Dream House, which is another one of these kind of evolving projects. And it evolved alongside the well-tuned piano from the mid-1960s to the present. And unfortunately, I was going to suggest that Saturday night we all go on a little field trip to Tribeca because there's the current instantiation of the Dream House. Is going on an ongoing basis, has for several years, at 275 Church Street on the 3rd floor. But it's closed right now because one of his students has an installation coming up in the same space. But if you're a local and you're interested in a very immersive experience with this stuff, you can head down to 275 Church Street. Check the website before you go, though. So, since the Dream House is closed, I'm going to give a terribly inferior simulation here using the same frequencies. So, the idea here is that this installation is created in collaboration with his spouse and longtime collaborator, Marian Zazila. She's a visual artist, and she works primarily with light. She blends light colors and casts different color shadows against suspended sculptures, so they cast different kinds of shadows and colors. And so that's she also, by the way, designed the visual element of the well-tuned piano presentation that you see there as well. So in the Dream House, you have a number of frequencies that are produced by a custom-built synthesizer that's very, very, very accurate in its tuning. And these sustained sounds are just projected into the space altogether from speakers on 4 sides. And you're supposed to just go into the space and spend quite a bit of time there. The first time I went, it was the first time I'd met Lamont, and I was going to interview him the next day. So I went to the Dream House the day before, sort of covertly, and spent several hours there. And then the next day, when I went to do the interview, he wasn't ready, and then I spent several more hours in the Dream House. And it really is, I went in sort of ready to try to balance my artistic appreciation with my sort of scholarly willingness to say the emperor wears no clothes if he's not wearing any clothes. but it's a pretty amazing experience if you're there for a while. The complexity of the sound owes to the fact that all of the frequencies have very specific relationships with each other. And I'm not going to get into that the whole spiral graph there. I mostly just brought it as kind of a quick visual aid shorthand that it's really, really complex. And you'll have to take my word for it. Just to describe it very briefly, all of the pitches, their frequencies have whole number relationships with each other, and shared whole number relationships with the lowest frequency, which we call the fundamental. And furthermore, most of the frequencies are very high prime numbers, or in some cases octave transpositions of very high prime numbers. So why does the prime number thing matter? And it's a big deal for Lamont. Without getting too technical, we can simply think of the relative consonance or dissonance of a harmonic interval, of the relationship between two pitches or frequencies, as a function of whether the math that our ears has to do to perceive that interval is hard ear math or easy ear math, okay? For example, if you hear a frequency that's 200 hertz and you hear another frequency that's 400 hertz, those two frequencies have a 2-to-1 relationship. And 2 over 1 is easy ear math. I hope it's easy. I mean, it's easy math and easy ear math. Because we hear that as an octave. If we hear 200 hertz and 300 hertz, that's a 3-to-2 ratio, and that's relatively easy ear math as well. So our ears hear that as what we call a perfect fifth. But it's slightly more complex. If you go up to, let's say, 900 hertz and 800 hertz, that gets a little more complex. The ear math is a little more complex. 17 over 16, even more so. So you can see as if you get higher and higher into the prime numbers, the interval becomes relatively more dissonant. And that's kind of what Lamont is trying to do with this piece, is explore dissonances that we haven't heard before. And a big function of dissonance is how familiar it is, whether we hear it as consonant or dissonant. So he's trying to find intervals that acoustically are not familiar at all, because nobody's ever had nobody's ever thought to try to make those intervals, and nobody's had the technology to create those intervals. So this is an exercise in a kind of extreme dissonance. And I wanted to also point some attention to the title of the musical component of the Dreamhouse, which is shown here. The bass 9 to 7 to 4 symmetry in prime time when centered above and below the lowest term primes in the range 288 to 224, with the addition of 279 and 261, in which the half of the symmetric division mapped above and including 288 consists of the powers of 2, multiplied by the primes within the ranges of 144 to 128, 72 to 64, and 36 to 32, which are symmetrical to those primes in lowest terms in the half of the symmetric division mapped below and including 224, within the ranges 126 to 112, 63 to 56, and 31.5 to 28, with the addition of 119. And at first glance, that might sound like sort of, beautiful mind kind of stuff. But that title accounts for every single sonic entity that you hear in the frequency array. So I'm running a little short on time, but I kind of want to do this. I think it'll be fun. So these sounds interact in a really volatile way with the physical space, because you have frequencies whose physical wavelengths they clash with each other, and they interact in interesting ways with the physical dimensions of the space and the objects in it, which includes us. So I'm going to play this for about a minute and a half, and if you'd like, you can get up, you can move around, and I just want you to listen to how you can kind of play the sound by turning your head, by moving and stopping. That's probably when you'll really notice it, is if you walk for a while and then you stop, you'll notice how the sound changes in different places in the room. Turn it up a little bit.
مثلا البحر.
Okay, you have about 20 seconds to find your way back to your seat. And like I said, that's a simulation, and the levels are off. I knew the frequencies, and so I just sort of recreated them on my laptop. But if you want to hear the real thing, it's worth the trip to Tribeca. Before I move on to a couple of other composers, I just wanted to mention that when I first began working with Lamont Young, he was very enthusiastic about my Mormon reading of his work. In fact, that was my foot in the door. That was the only reason he returned my call, even though he hadn't been a practicing Mormon for decades. However, over the subsequent decade, the position of Mormonism within the public eye, and perhaps in his personal and family life, changed quite dramatically, and he grew less comfortable with my attributing any of his ideas to his Mormon upbringing in some way, even though he himself had done so for decades before I ever met him. And eventually he wanted to downplay or even kind of erase his Mormon background in his biographical narrative to a degree of revisionism that I wasn't comfortable with. So we had a mutual falling out. And there's much more to this story, but if you want to hear that, we can talk about it later. And you can probably Google it a bit too. Just a word to the wise: if you're writing a book about a living composer, when you've settled on the title of your book, the first thing you need to do before you tell your editor the title of the book is you need to reserve your domain name. That's all I'll say about that. Okay, the next composer we're going to talk about, or the next artist we're going to talk about is Irv Wilson. Shortly after I began communicating with Lamont, he mentioned to me that there were a couple of other composers that he knew, the microtonal composers, that had come from Mormon backgrounds, and that had also developed a similar interest in a lot of the psychoacoustics and alternate tuning ideas that he had. And one of these was a name that was entirely new to me, a guy named Irv Wilson. Wilson, who died just last year, was born in the Mormon colonies in northern Mexico in 1928, where his family had relocated to shortly after the turn of the century. The earliest musical experiences in his memory were Mormon hymns and Mexican folk songs, and his family had a reed organ that he learned to play. At a very young age, though, he grew frustrated that there were notes that he heard in his head that he thought were missing from the keyboard. And he eventually studied at BYU for a time, but his frustrations about these missing notes caused tensions, and he left BYU. And I don't know what other elements were involved there, but later he encountered ancient and non-Western tuning theories that illuminated for him how to find those notes between the notes. And he taught himself tuning theories and developed these very elaborate acoustical architectural models for tuning systems and for instrument designs that could accommodate these tuning systems. And although Wilson didn't consider himself a composer per se, so much as a tuning theorist and a musical cosmologist, he did work with and influence a number of composers and theorists. So the musical excerpts that we're going to hear aren't actually his compositions, but they're works rendered expressly using his tuning ideas. Wilson was an utterly endearing eccentric and a voracious autodidact. So he didn't participate actively in the church as a Mormon, but he recognized his deep Mormon roots and maintained strong connections to his extended Mormon family and the ancestral farm in Mexico. He also received the missionaries and reportedly enlisted them for months in a project to sing through his favorite hymns using one of his favorite tuning systems, shown here. Because Wilson had no consistent institutional affiliation and distributed most of his ideas through photocopies of his handwritten designs rather than scholarly publications, so his work exists kind of in a hodgepodge of charts and graphs that he would send to me and a bunch of other people in the mail. And for a few years, I maintained an on and off written correspondence with Wilson, and he'd occasionally send me these fat envelopes of tuning charts that I haven't even begun to fully understand. But then one time he sent me, without any word of explanation, he just sent me a photocopy of his entire Sunday school songbook that he had encountered in his personal effects. And another time he sent me an article about corn cultivation. He was into genealogy, and he was into corn cultivation, and the charts for all of these look the same. The tuning, the genealogy, the corn. And at one time he sent me without any, usually he would send a note addressed to Brother Grimshaw, a handwritten note, and then a pile of wonderful stuff. One time he just sent me without any explanation. He had found a book, I think it was published in like the 1920s or 1930s, and it was a reference book for mechanical engineers, and it was just page after page of gear ratios. One of his students, the composer and multimedia performer Craig Grady, has archived much of Wilson's work online, but not in a traditional way. So Wilson's electronic archive is included as part of the website of the Embassy of Anaphoria. And if you're not familiar with the embassy, or if you're not familiar with the island nation of Anaphoria, that's because it exists entirely in Craig Grady's head. It's a fictional island whose indigenous music intersects in this wonderful, convoluted way with Wilson's ideas. So I'm going to play two little excerpts from two Anaphoria projects using Wilson's tunings. In the interest of time, I'm just going to play a bit from the mini Requiem. But both of these pieces are, you can find them online, excerpts online. other example that I'll just show briefly, and you're going to have to YouTube this on your own if you'd like. Wilson worked with Harry Partch, who's another well-known composer that played around with tuning and instrument design. And he took a tuning that Partch came up with, which is a 72 EDO, or 72 equal divisions of the octave tuning idea. And he came up with a keyboard layout that could accommodate this 72 pitch to the octave tuning. And eventually, a company by the name of Star Labs manufactured a keyboard based on Wilson's design, and it's called the Wilson Microzone U648. And there are a number of interesting YouTube videos you can look at for this. The last composer I want to talk about is James Tenney. He was born in Silver City, New Mexico in 1934. And his connection to the church is, I guess, the most tenuous. His family's participation in church life waned fairly early in his childhood. Still prior to his death in 2006, he expressed what I took to be more than just polite intrigue in the ideas that I was exploring about Mormon's embodiment and tuning and acoustics. And whether he explicitly recognized it as Mormon, his work continually explored new microscopic frontiers of acoustics and psychoacoustics. This is the score of a piece called Critical Band. And the title of the piece refers to the segment on the basilar membrane, which is wound up in a coil in your ear. But if you stretched it out, it would go from wide to narrow, and it has little hairs on it, and those hairs are what pick up the physical vibrations in the air that allow you to hear. And the activation of hairs on a particular part of the membrane is what allows us to perceive pitch. And the critical band refers to the width of the segment on the basilar membrane, where if that width of that is activated, then we hear two pitches rather than one messy pitch. Okay? The piece I want to play, and the last example that I'll play, is Tenney's piece, Spectral Canon for Conlon Nancaro. Tenney was very prolific, and he was a prolific writer and a fantastic and incredible and mind-boggling music theorist and philosopher. So, we really can't do him justice just by playing a little excerpt, but this piece really gets at a lot of what we're talking about, or what I'm trying to convey here. So this piece is for player piano, and it's a player piano tuned to just intonation, which is basically just means what we've encountered before, where all of the pitches have this whole number rational relationship with each other. Tenney's, the rhythms that with which the piano player articulates the keys is drawn from the harmonic relationships in this interesting logarithmic way. That as the piece grows and progresses and pitches are added in, their pitch relationships and their rhythmic relationships get really complex. These beautiful parabolas start to emerge that kind of illuminate for us rhythmically the kinds of complex relationships that we're perceiving more intuitively or more just psychoacoustically in the pitch realm. And I'm going to play this whole thing, and I hope it doesn't take me over time. to bring it back where I started, part of the reason that I'm excited to see young composers like Stewart and others exploring some of these ideas, part of the reason is that tuning is one of the most immediately tactile and visceral aspects of music, and it still holds a lot of drama for musicians and for audiences, because the way we tune instruments has been so ubiquitous for so long that when somebody messes with that, it really messes with our brains. And tuning holds a wealth of possibilities for music generally now, because a lot of the technological and technical and pragmatic constraints that made it difficult to play around with these ideas, a lot of those restraints are breaking down, either because of new technologies developing or just because of crazy young musicians that are willing to play around with frequency intervals. And I also think that to whatever extent Mormon embodiment kind of informed this handful of composers and a bunch of other folks that are interested in microtonality, to whatever extent that informed their ideas, regardless, I think that conjuring the notes, between the atomized pitches that are familiar to us, kind of ties powerfully into the universe that Mormons imagine, with these discrete Newtonian building blocks of matter somehow floating contiguously in this usually invisible fluid of spiritual substance. Thank you.